Hello to Richard Heinberg. This is Mike Grenville from Transition Forest Row. So thanks very much for talking to us today, Richard, on World Permaculture Day. Richard is widely regarded as the world's foremost peak oil educator. He's a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. He's the author of 10 books, including the greatly titled The Party's Over, which was back in 2003. Peak Everything in 2007, both of which were published in the UK, actually in Forest Row, where I live. So, your latest book, The End of Growth, a series of cheery titles that you that you have.
I always like to put a smile on my readers' faces.
Yes. Well. straight to the quick of where we are, but and I think we first met actually at the very first Transition Network conference, which took place at Nailsworth back in that would have been 5 years ago, just when Peak Everything came out. I think in 2007, a very small band of people who met on that rather rainy day. I remember.
I recall too.
That was quite an auspicious time, actually. So, how did you first of all get involved in permaculture? What's your connection to permaculture?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. My wife Janet and I took a class with Bill Mollison back in probably 1993, I would guess, and we've had a permaculture garden ever since. And then back in, I think it was 2006, David Holmgren invited me to come to Australia and tour the country with him, giving lectures. So we got to know each other pretty well on that trip, and so I've known about permaculture for a very long time and been very interested in the movement.
Great. I mean, one could say that really your title.
Excuse me.
Sure. The title of your book, I was going to say Peak Everything in particular. It feels like a very sort of permaculture sort of title in the sense that it joins the dots on lots of everything. The End of Growth doesn't sound on face value such a permaculture title, because permaculture is perhaps all about cycles and everything growing. But so what is it when you say the end of growth? You're obviously not thinking in a permaculture sense there.
Right. Well, I'm not talking about biological growth. I'm talking about growth of the economy as measured by GDP. And of course, permaculture understands limits. There are physical limits to our ability to extract resources and manufacture products and produce economic growth. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of permaculture in the 1970s, what Mollison and Holmgren were doing was basically developing a system for living that would work in a post-growth era. They understood, the 1970s was a period of oil crises. 1972, Limits to Growth came out.
Absolutely.
So it was really a time when people who understood what was going on in the world were beginning to grapple with this idea of natural limits to our economic processes, and permaculture was a response to that dilemma, and I think actually probably one of the very best responses that came out of the 1970s, and there were some very good ones.
So. Back in interesting, you relate back to the 1970s, and in fact, the sort of sense at that time was actually this time was about when we would be reaching those limits.
That's right.
And you are sort of saying that we are at those limits, and yet I was talking to George Marshall. I don't know if you've come across him, who runs an organisation called Coin in here, and he writes and talks a lot about. He gave a talk that I was at a while ago called "Why Does So Many People Still Not Believe in Climate Change?" And he had a view that somehow that capitalism would kind of stagger on and keep kind of patching itself up and so on. And I took a rather different view. That we're reaching the edge of things.
Yeah.
So how do you see capitalism, and its ability to, I mean, somehow it's amazing that, here we are, 2012, that the economic situation hasn't really fallen apart. It seems to keep staggering about.
Right. Well, what we have as an economic system 10 or 20 years from now might still call itself capitalism. But between now and then, we're going to go through the ringer. There's no question about that. The financial system and the monetary system that we have in the world today are precariously perched and set to go off the edge. And that's what the book is about. It would be hard to summarize the book in just a sentence, but basically, if you look at where we are in terms of debt, not just government debt, but also consumer debt in the industrialized countries, and if you look at where we are in terms of availability of resources, and particularly oil, and then if you look at the increasing costs of environmental disasters resulting from not only climate change, but also industrial accidents like the Deepwater Horizon, Fukushima disasters, and so on. There's a convergence going on, and that convergence is going to strangle the growth economy that we've been, quote, enjoying, unquote, for the last few decades. And quite soon, over the course of the next few years, this decade that we're in, 2010 to 2020, is the period almost certainly when economic growth will, as we've known it, will come to an end and begin to reverse. And that reversal will continue for several decades, because we are currently using more of Earth's productivity than Earth can regenerate on an annual basis, about 1.5 times that amount, according to the Global Footprint Network, the ecological footprint. So one way or another, the human economy is going to downsize itself until it can fit within what nature can provide.
Well, across Europe, we're already seeing that happening. I don't know who it was that said the future's already here. It's just not evenly spread.
That's right.
I was at a talk recently, and we had reports from Greece, from Ireland, from Portugal, and the lady from Portugal was saying, in my community, people are hungry now. And so, I think that's the thing. We think that the thing is just one solid thing, but actually it's already happening, but just not happening to us. And that's the challenge, is the point where actually we all agree. We're getting to that point where it clearly doesn't work anymore, and we have to do something differently. I think that's how long can denial go on before it really is?
Well, I think it can go on for quite some time for a lot of people. Right. But I think it's really important for at least the sort of 5% who are aware of what's happening to begin to pioneer ways of living that are more resilient and that can be replicated by lots of other people as the awareness spreads. And that's why I think permaculture is important. That's why I think transition is so important. It's not that, everyone in the world is going to be part of a transition town, in the foreseeable future. It's just not going to happen. But if that sort of 5% vanguard can really do its homework, then there will be a basis for a larger transition in society that inevitably will occur.
Well, I always say that we're all in transition, just not everybody realizes it.
Yes.
It's not like it's not a choice that we have to make. It's going to happen. So what's your vision for the future? You sort of couch things in terms of the next decade. How do you see things really panning out, or maybe actually putting it more optimistically? How would you like to see things? Because you're involved in the protocol, for example, to the tradable
oil depletion protocol.
Oil depletion protocol. Thank you. Yeah. So how would you like things to go from here?
Well, ideally, I think we would enter a period when governments at all levels, from the city all the way up to national and some sort of international forums like the United Nations, would begin to take limits to growth seriously, begin to substitute alternative measures for GDP, begin to rethink the financial system, understanding that returns on investments simply aren't going to be what they were in a post-growth society. So we have to plan for that and reduce the financial sector and its importance in the economy, and begin to support small-scale local manufacturing, put resilience at a much higher premium than economic efficiency, which is what the drum we've been banging for the past few decades, and it's put us way out of balance. We have a very economically efficient society as a result of globalization, but it's very fragile in the face of things like peak oil and climate change. Yeah. So that has to be reversed, and building resilience in society is something that really we know how to do, but what it looks like on the ground is to a large extent a reversal of the process of globalization. It means manufacturing and growing more locally. It means downsizing the financial sector, as I said earlier, and just making an economy that works for people and nature rather than for banks and financiers.
Absolutely. So what do you have a message that you can give for everybody on International Permaculture Day?
Well, keep on growing. It may be the end of growth for the financial economy, but certain other parts of society need to grow very substantially, and I think permaculture is one of those aspects of society that has a lot of expansion ahead of it, and so I'm really delighted to see how permaculture has been taking off over the past few years. Even a decade ago, the word permaculture was like Greek to most people, and I think that's changing pretty rapidly. So, I think we can afford to pat ourselves on the back, but there's still a lot of work ahead. So,
Richard, that's great. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Great.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And I think we first met actually at the very first Transition Network conference, which took place at Nailsworth back in, that would have been 5 years ago, just when Peak Everything came out, I think, in 2007. There was a very small band of people who met on that rather rainy day. Hello to Richard Heinberg. This is Mike Grenville from Transition Forest Row. So thanks very much for talking to us today, Richard, on World Permaculture Day. Richard is widely regarded as the world's foremost peak oil educator. He's a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. He's the author of The End of Growth, a series of cheery titles that you that you have.
I always like to put a smile on my readers' faces.
Yes. Well, straight to the quick of where we are, but remember.
I recall too.
That was quite an auspicious time, actually. So, how did you first of all get involved in permaculture? What's your connection to permaculture?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. My wife Janet and I took a class.
10 books, including the greatly titled "The Party's Over," which was back in 2003, Peak Everything in 2007, both of which were published in the UK, actually in Forest Row, where I live. So, your latest book